Jacob Hayes had been riding for hours under the scorching sun. The vast plains stretched endlessly in every direction, with golden grass swaying gently in the dry wind. The air was warm and dusty, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and earth. Jacob had been traveling alone for days, moving between small towns and isolated ranches, taking on odd jobs as a cowboy to earn his living. He was tall, with a weathered face that told stories of years spent under the open sky, and strong hands hardened from years of handling ropes, horses, and heavy work. As he rode along the winding trail that cut through the plains, he kept his eyes alert. Experience had taught him to notice the slightest changes in the land, the broken branch that hinted at an animal's path, the unusual footprints in the soil, or the faint smoke rising in the distance. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Daisy, moved steadily, her hooves kicking up soft clouds of dust. Jacob trusted Daisy completely. They had been together for years, and the bond between a cowboy and his horse was a quiet understanding that needed no words. Jacob was deep in thought about the next town he would reach, when a sudden movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the sunlight flickering through the branches, but then he saw it clearly. A small figure hanging from a tree in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. It was a young girl, dangling by what appeared to be a rope tied around her wrists. Her body swayed slightly with the breeze, and she let out a muffled cry that barely reached his ears. Without a second thought, Jacob spurred Daisy forward. The instinct to help someone in danger was stronger than any caution he might have felt. He rode faster, the wind whipping against his face and ruffling his hair. As he got closer, he could see more clearly that the girl was small, perhaps no older than 12 or 13. Her clothes were torn and dusty, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. The sight made Jacob's stomach tighten. He had seen hardship before in his life, but nothing struck him quite like the image of a child in such peril. When he finally reached the base of the tree, Jacob slowed Daisy to a careful walk. He studied the scene, noting the height at which the girl was hanging and the way the rope was tied. His mind raced through every possible way to get her down safely. Jacob was no stranger to danger, but he knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and the girl could fall, or worse. He looked up into her frightened eyes and gave a calm, steady voice. "Hold on, little one. I'm going to get you down. You'll be safe soon." The girl's eyes widened at his voice. There was a mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief in her expression. She nodded slightly, too scared to speak, but somehow understanding that this cowboy meant no harm. Jacob unbuckled his rope from his saddle, planning to use it to secure her as he lowered her from the tree. Daisy stamped her hooves impatiently, but remained calm, sensing Jacob's tension. Jacob climbed the low branches carefully, making sure his weight didn't shift too much. He reached for the rope around the girl's wrists, speaking softly the entire time to keep her calm. "Almost there. Just hang on a little longer," he whispered. Sweat ran down his face from the effort and the heat, but he didn't allow himself to pause. Every second counted. When he finally grabbed her hands, he felt the rope's coarse fibers bite into his skin, but he ignored it. With a careful pull and gentle maneuvering, he managed to lift the girl slightly and untie the knot. Her small hands finally came free, and she sagged in relief, leaning against Jacob's chest for a moment. Jacob lowered her slowly to the ground, ensuring she landed safely on her feet. The girl's legs trembled, and she clung to him, still shivering from fear and exhaustion. Jacob wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, trying to warm her and give her a sense of safety. The young girl's dark eyes were wide and alert, studying Jacob as if trying to understand who he was. She didn't speak, but her gaze held a silent story of fear, pain, and survival. Jacob crouched down to her level and smiled gently. "You're safe now. Nothing is going to hurt you while I'm here." His voice was steady, calm, and reassuring, and slowly, he noticed her body relax just a little. As he helped her take a few steps away from the tree, Jacob looked around. The plains seemed quiet again, the kind of quiet that could hide danger or peace. He scanned the horizon, alert to any signs of trouble. But nothing moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. For a moment, Jacob allowed himself to feel relief. The girl was alive. And he had acted in time. Then, a faint sound reached his ears, something subtle but unusual in the stillness. A rustle of leaves, the quiet snap of a twig underfoot, almost imperceptible. Jacob's instincts immediately sharpened. He had spent too many years on these lands not to sense when something was off. Slowly, he shifted his weight and scanned the edges of the clearing. The girl noticed his pause and whispered, "Who are you?" Her voice was small, hesitant, and cautious. Jacob smiled kindly. "My name is Jacob. I'm just a cowboy. I'm here to help you." She nodded, her lips pressed together tightly. Her eyes darted toward the shadows beyond the trees, and Jacob realized she might be afraid of more than just falling. Perhaps she was running from someone or something. He didn't ask immediately. He knew the right time would come. First, he had to make sure she felt safe. Jacob handed her a canteen of water and helped her take a few sips. She drank cautiously, her small hands trembling as she held the metal container. Jacob could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the strain of whatever ordeal she had faced before he arrived. His heart ached for her, but he knew he had to stay calm. Showing fear, now, would only make her panic. As he guided her toward a small patch of shade, Jacob noticed the little things, the dirt under her fingernails, the dried tears on her cheeks, the way her clothes hung loosely from her small frame. He realized that this girl had been through a lot, though she tried to appear strong. She had survived on her own, or perhaps with others, but something had left her vulnerable. Jacob made a mental note to be extra careful and gentle with her, knowing that trust could not be rushed. By now, the sun had moved higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. Jacob knew they couldn't linger here for too long. The trail he had been following was isolated, and help was far away. He gently suggested that they move toward a safer area, speaking softly so as not to frighten her. "Come on, little one. Let's find a place where you can rest and be safe." The girl hesitated but eventually took his hand, allowing him to lead her away from the tree. Every step was slow and careful. Jacob kept glancing over his shoulder, alert to any sudden movement, but the plains remained quiet. For the first time since he saw her, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had acted quickly, courageously, and without hesitation. The moment had passed, but he knew the memory of it would stay with him forever. Even as they walked, Jacob's mind was racing. Who had left the girl hanging in the tree? Why? Was she lost? Or was there more danger ahead? He didn't know yet. But one thing was certain. He would not let harm come to her. He was a cowboy, used to facing danger and the unknown, and he knew that today, his instincts and courage had made a difference. By the time they reached a small grove of trees, offering shade and a brief respite from the relentless sun, Jacob finally allowed himself to breathe a little easier. The girl sat down on the soft grass, exhausted but safe, and Jacob knelt beside her. He offered her a piece of dried bread from his pack, and she took it silently, still unsure, but trusting him more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. Jacob looked out over the plains, feeling the vastness of the land and the challenges it held. He knew that more difficulties might lie ahead, but for now, he had done what mattered most. He had saved a life. And as he watched the little girl resting, he realized that sometimes courage was not just about facing danger, but about acting with compassion, even when the risks were unknown. The sun hung high in the sky, beating down on the wide-open plains, but Jacob Hayes did not pay it much attention. His mind was fully focused on the young girl he had just rescued. She sat quietly under the shade of a low tree, her small frame trembling slightly as she tried to recover from the ordeal. Jacob knelt beside her, offering the water he carried and speaking softly to reassure her. "Take it slow. You need to rest," he said. His voice was calm, steady, and warm. And slowly, she took a few more sips, her hands finally loosening around the canteen. The girl's dark eyes met his, cautious but curious. She did not speak, but the way she looked at him told Jacob that she was trying to understand who he was and why he had helped her. Jacob knew that trust could not be rushed. He had seen enough in his years on the plains to know that people who had faced danger often kept their feelings hidden until they felt safe. He handed her a piece of bread from his small pack. She took it slowly, nibbling at it like a bird, still wary of the world around her. Jacob watched her carefully. Her clothes were torn and dusty, her skin smudged with dirt, and her hair tangled from whatever had happened before he arrived. Despite all that, there was a quiet strength about her, a determination to survive that made him respect her even more. Jacob decided it was time to move her somewhere safer. He knew they could not stay near the tree. It was too exposed, and he had no idea if anyone else might be nearby. He offered her his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it. She was small, but Jacob could feel her slight weight, and he guided her carefully across the uneven ground. Every step had to be cautious. A wrong move could hurt her or make her lose trust in him. As they walked, Jacob kept scanning the horizon. The plains stretched endlessly, golden waves of grass rippling in the wind. Every shadow, every rustle of grass, made him alert. He had lived in these lands for years and had learned to trust his instincts. There was something subtle in the air, something that told him to be watchful. He didn't know exactly what, but he felt the tension building, like the calm before a storm. The girl finally spoke, her voice small and hesitant. "Why? Why did you help me?" she asked. Her words were barely above a whisper, but Jacob could hear the fear in them. He smiled gently. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "No one should be left hanging in a tree, especially a little girl like you." She nodded slowly, but her eyes remained wary. Jacob could tell she had been hurt before, not just physically, but in ways he could not see. She had learned to be cautious, to protect herself, and that caution would take time to fade. Jacob understood. He had seen fear in many faces during his life on the plains. Some people learned to trust quickly, others took longer. As they continued, he told her his name. "I'm Jacob Hayes. I work on ranches and ride these trails often." She nodded, as if trying to remember the name, but did not answer. He respected that. Sometimes, silence spoke more than words. The plains began to change subtly as they walked. The grass grew taller in some places, and the ground became rockier. Jacob chose a path that led toward a small creek he knew about. Water would help the girl recover, and he could rest there for a while before figuring out their next move. Along the way, Jacob noticed small signs of movement in the grass. He paused, listening carefully. There was no immediate danger, but he sensed that someone, or something, had been here recently. Perhaps animals, perhaps people. He could not be certain. He kept his hand on the handle of his knife, though he did not want to frighten the girl. Instead, he slowed his pace and walked with even more caution. The girl stumbled once, and Jacob immediately steadied her. "Easy there," he said softly. "We're almost at the creek. You can rest soon." She nodded, leaning on him for support. Jacob felt a surge of protectiveness. This child was alone in a harsh world, and he had taken it upon himself to ensure she would make it to safety. Finally, they reached the creek. The sound of flowing water was soothing, and the girl's eyes lit up slightly. Jacob led her to a shaded spot by the bank and helped her sit on a flat rock. "Here, drink some water," he said, offering her a fresh sip from the canteen. She drank eagerly this time, as if finally allowing herself to believe she was safe. Jacob looked around, taking note of the surroundings. The creek was surrounded by thick bushes and a few scattered trees, providing some cover from anyone who might be watching. It was not a permanent safe place, but it would serve for now. Jacob also knew that staying too long in one place was dangerous. The plains were vast, but danger could be closer than it appeared. While the girl rested, Jacob thought about what to do next. He could not leave her here alone, and he could not take her to a town without knowing more about where she had come from or who she was running from. He needed information, but he had to be careful not to frighten her. Trust had to come first. He sat quietly beside her, not pressing her to speak, just keeping her company. Slowly, she began to relax. Her shoulders dropped, and her breathing became steadier. Jacob offered her a small piece of cloth from his pack to wipe the sweat and dirt from her face. She took it with trembling hands, and for the first time, she managed a small, shy smile. Jacob smiled back. "See? It's not so bad," he said gently. "We'll get you cleaned up, and you'll feel better in no time." The girl nodded, still quiet. But Jacob sensed that she was beginning to trust him. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob prepared a small area for them to rest. He gathered dry grass and leaves to make a comfortable spot for her to sit or lie down. Daisy, his horse, grazed nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. Jacob knew the importance of being vigilant. The plains were beautiful, but they were also full of dangers that could appear without warning. Jacob tried to learn more about the girl, speaking gently, without pressure. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said softly, "Ayana." Jacob nodded. "Ayana. That's a beautiful name. You have a strong one too." She looked at him with a mix of curiosity and caution, unsure what to make of his kindness. "Did someone hurt you?" he asked carefully. Ayana shook her head slightly, but her eyes filled with tears. Jacob understood. Some stories were too painful to tell at first. He did not press her. Instead, he spoke about the land, the animals, and the skies. He wanted her to feel normal again, even for a little while. The day began to pass, and the sun moved lower, casting long shadows across the plains. Jacob knew they needed to find a safer place before nightfall. He helped Ayana stand, supporting her as they moved along the creek. He noticed that she was gaining a little confidence with each step, though she still clung to him whenever the ground became uneven. As they walked, Jacob remained alert. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird was analyzed. He had to be ready for anything. He could not let his guard down, even for a moment. Finally, they reached a small natural shelter, formed by rocks and overhanging trees. It was not much, but it offered protection from the wind and any unwanted eyes. Jacob helped Ayana sit comfortably and made sure she had water and a little food. Daisy grazed nearby, and Jacob felt a small sense of relief. They were safe for now. Jacob reflected on the day's events. He had acted quickly, without thinking about the danger to himself, to save a life. He had rescued Ayana from a situation that could have been fatal, and he had managed to earn her trust in the process. But he knew that the journey was far from over. The plains were unpredictable, and he had no way of knowing what lay ahead. Yet, despite the uncertainty, Jacob felt a quiet satisfaction. He had done what he believed was right, and in doing so, he had proven that courage and kindness could coexist. As night began to fall, he kept a watchful eye on the horizon, determined to protect Ayana and see her safely through whatever challenges awaited them. And as the stars began to appear one by one in the vast sky above, Jacob knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would test his courage, his patience, and his heart. The night settled over the plains like a heavy blanket, and the stars began to twinkle in the endless sky. Jacob Hayes kept a small fire burning near their temporary shelter, its glow casting flickering shadows on the rocks and trees. Ayanna sat close to the fire, wrapped in Jacob's jacket, her eyes wide as she stared at the dancing flames. The crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the plains, the rustle of leaves, the cry of a distant owl were the only companions in the quiet night. Jacob, however, could not relax. His instincts told him that their troubles were far from over. The plains were quiet, almost too quiet, and that always meant danger. He had spent years riding these lands, and he knew that the calm could hide threats. He glanced at Ayanna, whose exhaustion was evident in the way her small body leaned against his. Despite her weariness, there was a cautious alertness in her eyes that mirrored his own. He had a sense, deep in his gut, that the ordeal she had faced before he found her was far from ordinary. Something about the way she had been left hanging in the tree, so carefully placed as if someone had planned it, told him that this was no accident. Jacob had seen traps set by people many times, and he knew that appearances could be deceiving. He decided to remain vigilant, knowing that he would need every ounce of his skill to protect both himself and Ayanna. As the fire crackled, Jacob quietly checked their surroundings. The rocks offered some shelter, and the trees provided partial cover, but he knew that if someone were watching, they would have a clear view of the small fire. He kept his eyes on the shadows, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his knife. The wind shifted, and with it came the faintest sound, a soft step on dry grass. Jacob froze, listening intently. Ayanna noticed the change in his expression and whispered, "Jacob, what is it?" He put a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. He scanned the area, every muscle tense, his mind running through all the possibilities. The sound repeated, this time slightly closer. Jacob's heart did not race with fear, but with careful calculation. He had to assess the situation before acting. Then he saw them. Figures moving slowly and deliberately in the shadows beyond the trees. Their movements were careful, almost too careful, like hunters approaching prey. Jacob recognized the signs immediately. This was a trap. The girl he had rescued had been used as bait, placed in a vulnerable position to lure someone into danger. The realization sent a chill through him, but he did not show it. Panic would not help them. Jacob quietly whispered to Ayanna, "Stay behind me. Do exactly as I say." Her eyes widened in fear, but she nodded. She trusted him, and that trust was now their most valuable asset. Jacob moved slightly, positioning himself between her and the approaching figures. The moonlight revealed more details. They were Apache warriors, skilled and patient, their faces partially concealed. Their eyes fixed on him and the girl. Jacob knew that confrontation could be deadly. He had faced many dangers, but he also knew that careful negotiation and respect could sometimes prevent violence. He studied their approach, noting their numbers and movements. There were at least 4 or 5, maybe more, moving silently through the shadows. Each one was alert, watching for the slightest sign of weakness. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying across the distance without a hint of aggression. "I mean no harm," he said. "I only saved the girl. I don't want trouble." The warriors paused, their eyes narrowing. They had expected a lone cowboy to charge recklessly, not someone who would stay calm and speak sensibly. Jacob's steady presence gave him a small advantage. One of the warriors stepped forward slightly, his hands empty but ready. He spoke in a language Jacob did not understand, but his tone was commanding, authoritative. Jacob remained still, watching carefully, and used gestures to show he was unarmed and meant no harm. Ayanna clutched his arm, her small fingers digging into his jacket, and Jacob gave her a reassuring squeeze. The standoff lasted several long minutes. Jacob's mind raced, calculating every option. He could not fight all of them. It would be foolish. He needed to find a way to gain their trust, or at least create an opening for escape. Slowly, he reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of dried meat, tossing it gently toward the nearest warrior. It was a simple gesture, but one that showed goodwill. The warrior hesitated, then picked up the meat. The tension eased slightly, and Jacob saw an opportunity. He took a careful step forward and raised his hands, signaling peace. "I just want to help the girl. She is safe with me. We will leave your lands peacefully." His voice was steady, respectful, and firm. The warriors exchanged quiet words among themselves, their eyes never leaving him. Jacob remained patient, understanding that this was a test of character. They wanted to see if he was brave, reckless, or respectful. His calm and deliberate actions spoke louder than any words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead warrior nodded slightly. Jacob interpreted this as a sign to continue speaking carefully. "I don't want to take anything from you," he said. "I only ask that we go on our way without conflict." The warrior's eyes softened a fraction, and the others mirrored the gesture. Jacob felt a flicker of hope. He slowly began to back away, guiding Ayanna with him, keeping his eyes on the warriors and their movements. Every step had to be measured. He could not afford sudden moves that might trigger aggression. The girl stayed close to him, her trust now evident in her willingness to follow his lead without hesitation. As they moved through the shadows, Jacob noticed small markers in the ground, sticks, stones, and footprints that suggested the path had been watched. This confirmed his earlier suspicion. The girl had been a lure, and the warriors were skilled trackers. But they had also shown restraint, which Jacob respected. He decided to honor that respect by remaining calm and careful. The moon rose higher, illuminating the path ahead. Jacob's knowledge of the terrain allowed him to take subtle detours, avoiding open areas where they could be trapped. He guided Ayanna through narrow passages between rocks and trees, keeping her out of sight while maintaining a safe distance from the warriors. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, and careful. Ayanna began to relax slightly as they moved. She whispered, "Jacob, why didn't they hurt us?" He smiled faintly, keeping his voice low. "Because I stayed calm and showed respect. Sometimes courage is not about fighting. It's about knowing how to act." She nodded, absorbing his words, though she was still wary. Jacob's mind never stopped working. He knew that once they were clear of the immediate trap, they would need a more secure place to rest. He also knew that the warriors would continue to watch from a distance, waiting to see if he made a mistake. Every action had to be precise. Finally, after what seemed like hours of careful movement, Jacob found a small, hidden ravine that offered both cover and a place to rest. The rocky walls and dense bushes provided protection, and he guided Ayanna to the safest spot. She sat down, exhausted, and Jacob kept watch. Daisy, his horse, grazed nearby, alert to every sound. Jacob reflected on the encounter. He had been tested in ways he had not anticipated. The girl had been a trap, yet he had managed to protect her without causing harm. His mind replayed every decision, the calm words, the gestures of peace, the careful steps, and he realized that courage was not always about confrontation. Sometimes it was about patience, respect, and the ability to think clearly under pressure. Ayanna rested against him, her breathing steady but still light with fear. Jacob knew that she had witnessed the danger and would need reassurance for some time. He spoke softly. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." She nodded, leaning closer, and for a moment, the tension of the day seemed to lift slightly. Jacob did not allow himself to relax completely. The plains were unpredictable, and the warriors could return, but he had gained valuable information. They had been testing him, and his actions had earned a measure of respect. He understood that this was part of the larger world he lived in, a world where every choice mattered, and every action could have consequences. As the night deepened, Jacob kept his eyes on the horizon, alert and ready. The stars above seemed to offer a sense of calm, but he knew that vigilance was necessary. He glanced at Ayanna, asleep now, and felt a quiet determination. He would protect her, no matter what. The plains were vast and full of dangers, but he had learned that courage, patience, and respect could overcome even the most carefully set traps. The fire burned low, and Jacob's thoughts wandered to the journey ahead. He would need to find food, water, and a safer place to travel. But more importantly, he had to be ready for anything the plains or the warriors might present. He understood that the challenges of the world were not always visible, and that sometimes danger was hidden in plain sight. For now, he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had survived the trap, and the girl he had rescued was still with him. The night was still. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time in hours, Jacob felt that he could breathe, even just a little. The journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The stars above the plains were bright, their cold light flickering over the rugged land, and the night air carried the faintest chill that reminded Jacob Hayes that the world was never truly at rest. The fire had burned low, its embers casting soft red glows on the ground around them. Jacob sat with his back against a large rock, his eyes fixed on the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. He wasn't sure if the Apache warriors would return, but he couldn't afford to take chances. Ayanna was asleep beside him, her small form curled up against his jacket, which she had pulled tightly around herself for warmth. The night seemed peaceful now, but Jacob knew how quickly that could change. Despite everything that had happened, he felt a quiet sense of responsibility to her. She had been through more than any child should ever endure, and yet she had shown courage, even in the face of fear. Jacob's mind kept replaying the events of the day, the rescue, the tension, the narrow escape from the trap set by the Apache warriors. It all felt like a blur, but each moment was etched in his memory. He thought about the decisions he had made, the careful words, the measured steps, the way he had tried to show the warriors that he meant no harm. He had been lucky, yes, but he also knew that his calm and respect had played a large part in keeping them safe. He glanced down at Ayanna, watching her sleep. She was small and fragile-looking, but Jacob had seen a spark in her that he admired. She had endured hardship, and yet she hadn't given up. That strength was something he understood, something he recognized in himself. But what had brought her to this place? Who had left her hanging from that tree? And why? Jacob didn't have answers, but he knew that whatever her past, it was something that needed to be addressed. He couldn't simply leave her on her own. He had saved her life, but her journey was far from over, and it was clear she needed someone to help guide her through it. The fire began to die down, and Jacob carefully poked at the embers, stirring them to keep a small flame alive. He knew they couldn't stay here for long. The ravine was well hidden for now, but it wasn't a permanent solution. They needed to move on, find shelter, and keep heading west, toward the nearest town. But that meant a long ride, and Jacob couldn't risk being spotted by anyone who might mean harm. The Apache warriors were still a presence, and they would not forget the man who had disrupted their trap. Jacob wondered what had led them to set it in the first place. Had it been a test? A warning to strangers who rode through their land? Whatever the reason, Jacob knew that the next step in his journey would not be as simple as just continuing on. Ayanna stirred beside him, her eyes opening slowly. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the low light of the fire. Her expression was still guarded, but there was a hint of curiosity in her gaze. Jacob smiled softly at her. "Good morning, Ayanna. How are you feeling?" She didn't immediately respond, but after a moment, She nodded slightly. She didn't look at him directly, but her voice, though quiet, was stronger than it had been. "I'm okay," she said, though there was an undertone of uncertainty in her words. Jacob understood. It had been a long, hard day for her, and she had been through so much. He wanted to give her space, but also to make sure she knew she wasn't alone. He stood and stretched his legs. "We'll need to keep moving soon. We can't stay here for too long." Ayanna didn't say anything, but she stood up slowly, her movements cautious. Jacob handed her some dried fruit and a little water, which she accepted without question. They ate in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Jacob's mind wandered back to the moment when he had first seen her dangling from the tree, helpless and alone. He couldn't imagine how she had gotten into that situation, but he knew she had been brave enough to survive it. After a while, Jacob packed up their things, securing the small bundle on his horse. He checked the area one more time to make sure no one was watching. The plains were vast and open, but there were places to hide if you knew where to look. Jacob had spent enough time here to know how to move through the land without being detected. Still, his eyes never stopped scanning. Ayanna, now standing beside him, looked up at him with a question in her eyes. Jacob gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll keep heading west. There's a small town, not too far from here. It'll be safer." She nodded, though she still seemed unsure. It was obvious that she had little trust in towns or anyone who might be there. Jacob didn't press her, but he could tell that she was struggling with something. There was a heaviness in her eyes, a deep sadness that she hadn't shared with him. He could only guess at the reasons, but he knew that she would speak when she was ready. As they rode on, the land began to change. The open plains slowly gave way to rolling hills and sparse patches of trees. Jacob kept a steady pace, knowing that the day would be long. He kept an eye on Ayanna as they rode, noticing how she would glance around from time to time, still alert, still on edge. He understood. She had learned to be cautious, to expect danger at any turn. Ayanna's silence wasn't uncomfortable to Jacob. He had spent much of his life alone on the trail, and sometimes silence was the only company a man needed. But he wanted to help her, to show her that not everyone in the world meant harm. He thought of his own journey, of how he had carved out a life in these unforgiving lands. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts told him that Ayanna needed more than just safety. She needed healing. As they continued their ride, Jacob tried to think of what to say, something that might break the wall of silence between them. "You know," he said after a while, "I've been riding this land for years. It's a hard place to live, but it teaches you a lot about what matters." Ayanna looked at him briefly, her expression unreadable. Jacob smiled gently. "It teaches you to trust the right people, and it teaches you how to keep going, even when things get tough." She didn't respond, but Jacob noticed her shoulders relax slightly. He knew that the weight of her past wasn't something that could be lifted by a few kind words. It would take time. The day passed quietly as they rode west. The landscape grew more varied, with patches of forest and streams crossing their path. Jacob was careful to choose routes that kept them hidden as much as possible. The last thing he wanted was to be seen by anyone who might be watching from a distance. Eventually, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, they reached the outskirts of a small town. It wasn't much, just a handful of buildings scattered along a dirt road, but it would be a safe place for the night. Jacob led Daisy and Ayanna toward the hitching post at the edge of town, scanning the surroundings one last time to make sure there was no immediate danger. As they dismounted, Jacob glanced at Ayanna. She had been so quiet all day, but now her eyes seemed to light up with curiosity. She looked at the town with a mix of wariness and wonder. Jacob smiled. "It's not much, but it'll do. We'll get you some food, and find a place to rest." Ayanna hesitated, but she followed him as they walked into the small general store. The building was humble, but inviting, with an old wooden counter and shelves lined with supplies. A man behind the counter looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Jacob, but softening when he saw the girl. Jacob approached the counter and spoke in a friendly tone. The man nodded, and Jacob quickly purchased some provisions, food, water, and a blanket for the night. He glanced back at Ayana, who stood by the door, still unsure of the new surroundings. Jacob's heart went out to her. She was just a girl, and the world had been unkind to her. As they left the store, Jacob turned to her. "You're safe here for now, Ayana. We'll get you some rest, and tomorrow we'll figure out what's next." Ayana nodded slowly, her eyes searching the streets of the town, still cautious. Jacob didn't blame her. Trust wasn't something that could be given easily, especially after everything she had been through. But he also knew that, with time, the fear would begin to fade, and Ayana would start to heal. For now, they would rest, and tomorrow, they would continue their journey together,